Thank you for having me. So as a way of introducing myself, it's kind of hard to put one title on what I do, so I think it's easiest to just say that I make things, some of which come out nicely. I make websites, of course. I currently help make the booking.com website as a designer. I've written 2 books that I think came out well. I created 2 human beings who are pretty great, as Mark just mentioned. I like to cook, and I think I'm pretty good at making cakes. This is a peppermint cheesecake that I made that did come out quite nicely. But not everything that I make is successful. I also make a lot of mistakes. For instance, I love gardening. I really do. But for some reason, most of my plants die. It's kind of like a cliche sort of thing. I'm not proud of that fact, but it just is reality. So like, here's my latest try at a mixed herb pot. I had this like vision of this mini herb garden right outside my kitchen window. But it did not work out as I had, kind of planned. Someone else who made mistakes is the woman who painted Monkey Jesus. So this lady, who was not a trained artist and certainly not a trained art restorer, was nevertheless so confident in her abilities that she saw this 100-year-old painting of Jesus deteriorating in her church, and she was like, I am going to fix this. And the picture on the right is what she ended up with, Monkey Jesus. And I can just kind of imagine her starting to paint, and she's not like, crap, I'm ruining this painting. She was like, yes, I can do this. And so maybe some of you have the confidence of the Monkey Jesus painter, and I congratulate you, but I'm guessing that most of us have to deal with the self-doubt and fear of making mistakes. The trouble is that fear of making mistakes often keeps us from learning and trying new things in web design and development. Just last year, I used Sass for the first time, and I had never used a CSS preprocessor before. I felt really guilty about this, or maybe embarrassed is the better word, because by then it seemed like everybody who was doing CSS had already jumped on the Sass bandwagon. But I was overwhelmed. I didn't know where to start. I tend to think that I have to learn something from A to Z before I can even start to use it. And so I wanted to set up all my Sass files and rules perfectly on my first try. I didn't want to use it incorrectly or incompletely. But of course, when did I ever have time to learn every aspect of Sass so that I could finally switch over to it? What I didn't realize is that changing a single line of CSS is really all that was needed to get started. Your Sass isn't wrong if you don't use every feature that's available to you. So if you've never used Sass either, that's perfectly fine, but let me just show you how simple it can be. You can install Preproc, which is free software for Windows and Mac that turns your Sass into CSS. Drag your website's folder into Preproc so that it will monitor your files in it. In this folder, create a file named styles.scss, and then write in it this stuff which sets up a few color variables. Save the file, and that's it. You've written Sass. Your CSS is powered by Sass. And so is this perfect Sass, like the epitome of Sassness? No. But trying it out, even imperfectly, made me feel confident that I could do more, and so I did do more, and I'm not done. It really was not scary. One of the reasons that I think we fear making mistakes is because we tend not to see others' mistakes, only their finished product all fixed up. We may think that we are the only ones struggling to learn or do something. We don't see the struggle that others went through. I'm sure all of you have people in web design or web development that you look up to who just make you sick with the awesome work that they produce. And our web design and development idols may seem like different types of people than us. Special people, well, we're just normal people. But even our web idols struggle and screw up. And that's a good thing, because making mistakes is essential to being successful. Professor Edward D. Hess has studied innovation for years and found that innovation requires a mindset that rejects the fear of failure and replaces that fear of failure with the joy of exploration and experimental learning. Failure is not the end goal. So when you read about how you ought to be failing in your work, it's not, if you want to be innovative, it's not that you are trying to fail. It's just that failure is a necessary, unavoidable byproduct of all of the experiments that lead to innovation and success. According to another professor, Dean Keith Simonton, people that we think of as creative geniuses like Van Gogh or Mozart or Darwin fail all the time. They just don't let that stop them. So his research found that creative people are not special people. They simply do more experiments than other people. And in doing so, they come up with more successes and a lot more failures, too. So let me give you some personal CSS-related examples of the necessity of making mistakes. So first, last year, I was working on a new presentation on Flexbox for a conference. I had spoken some about Flexbox before and made demos for it, but I wanted to make a brand new demo for this presentation. So I created a site devoted to s'mores because they're delicious. It's an American dessert, if you're not familiar, and I'm kind of obsessed with coming up with crazy s'mores concoctions. So I made this builder form to help facilitate the creation of such concoctions with the 4 components of s'mores in these 4 tan boxes, and then an action bar with the field to name your s'mores combination at the bottom. Without Flexbox, I would wrap all 4 components in a div or section together, separate from the action box, but this extra structure in the markup limits where I can lay out these component boxes in relation to the action box. With Flexbox, I can leave all 5 boxes as siblings, and then I use the FlexWrap property on their container to wrap the 5th onto its own line, the action box. But FlexWrap just says that the items are allowed to wrap if needed. This doesn't force them to. So to force a wrap to occur before the 5th box, I use the Flex property to control its width. Let me first explain how Flex works, in case you are not that familiar with Flexbox. It's set on Flex items, not their container, and it can affect either their width or their height, depending on whether those items are laid out horizontally or vertically. And there's 3 components to a Flex value. It's a shorthand property: Flex grow, Flex shrink, and Flex basis. Flex grow means how much the Flex item will grow relative to the other items if there's extra space available in its line. Or you can think of it as the proportion or number of shares of extra space that it gets. Flex shrink means how much the item will shrink relative to others if there's not enough space, or the proportion of the overflowing pixels that will have to get chopped off of itself to get everything to fit again. And Flex basis is the initial starting dimension before free space is added on or taken away from the item, and it can be set to any standard width or height value. When you're reading about Flexbox, you often see single-digit Flex values in the examples, which is fine to use. That digit becomes the Flex grow value. So knowing all that about how the Flex property worked, my thought process for sizing the 5 boxes in the builder form went like this. I want all 4 components to be the same width, so I'll set Flex to 1 for each, so they each get 1 share of the space on the line. And then to force the action section to new line, all I have to do is give it Flex basis of 100%, because if it's 100% wide, it won't fit with anything else, so it will wrap to a second line. Perfect. And this is what I ended up with. Everything squished and overlapping. I was totally baffled. Like I said, I had created Flexbox demos before, and I had gotten this same CSS of wrapping a 100% wide Flex item to work before. So to figure out what was the problem in my new demo, I took my previous good demo and I began gradually removing pieces of the CSS until I found what triggered the wrap that I wanted. It was side margins on the boxes. So I applied this to my new demo, and I found that if I put just 1 pixel of margin on one of the component boxes, the action box would wrap as I wanted it to. But I still had no idea why this was happening. So I wrote this comment next to the 1 pixel margin in the CSS, and you can tell by the 3 question marks that I was really frustrated because I'm a firm believer in just 1 question mark, or, proper punctuation at all times. But so I wrote this, and then I just left the page for a while. I finally forced myself to go back to the spec and reread the information on the Flex property and the Flexbox layout algorithm a few times, which was super fun. And I started playing around with random Flex values to see how they might change things, and I finally had this eureka moment. What was happening was that by setting Flex to 1, I was inadvertently setting Flex basis to 0, because when you leave off Flex basis in the Flex shorthand, it gets set to 0 pixels. Since Flex basis is the starting width for each box, it's basically min width, at least when Flex wrap is on, because the browser never has to shrink anything smaller than that starting width to make things fit. It can just wrap instead if things aren't fitting. So the Flex basis value of 0 pixels meant 0 pixels was my min width, and it allowed all 4 components to shrink down to 0 pixels wide if needed. And the browser shrunk them to 0 pixels wide only because it had a 100% wide box that it was trying to fit to. And my flex value of 1 told the browser that this was OK to do if it needed to. This was an early skeleton of the page before I had added any padding or border or margin onto the component boxes, so they each took up exactly 0 pixels of space in total. So if they take up literally no space, then it's perfectly fine for the action box to sit on the same line with them, and that's exactly what happened. So that's why adding a side margin fixed everything. It made the component boxes take up more space than 0 pixels, so the 100% wide action box would not fit with them and would have to wrap. But the margin was just a stopgap measure. To really fix it, I changed the component's flex basis to 200 pixels. That meant that the components would start out at that width. So when the browser would go to add the 100% wide action section, it would never have room for it on a line with any of the components and would always have to wrap it to a new line. So I fixed it. I made a mistake, I fixed it, and I finally created the layout that I was after successfully. This was not just a case of succeeding despite a mistake. This was a case of succeeding because of a mistake. Before I made this mistake with setting flex to 1, I had never really given flex basis a lot of thought. I thought it was pretty simple, I understood it well enough, and most of the time could just kind of ignore it and go on using single-digit flex values. But after making this mistake and then solving it, I felt like I finally truly understood flex basis. And what's more, that this was the key to understanding the flex property. And understanding the flex property is, in my opinion, the whole foundation for understanding Flexbox. If I had not made this mistake, because let's say that I started out with margins on the boxes and I never saw the squished version, I would never have unlocked this understanding of Flexbox. So the mistake was essential. It was frustrating, but it was a tremendous learning experience. Now, that doesn't mean that I was now a complete expert in Flexbox and never made a single mistake in it ever again and lived happily ever after where like IE9 and earlier don't exist. No, unfortunately, it was not long before I made another mistake that hinged on flex basis being secretly set to 0. If you've read at all about Flexbox, you've probably read how you can use the flex property to make boxes be proportional to one another in size, because this is a really cool feature that all the tutorials make sure to point out. So if I set 2 boxes to flex 1 and 1 box to flex 2, the flex 2 box will be twice as wide as the others. The browser will first allocate pixels to padding, margin, border, and then it sees how many are left for the flex widths, and it gives 2 pixels to the flex 2 box for every 1 pixel that it gives to each of the flex 1 boxes. You can kind of think of it like grid units in a CSS framework. So the box on the right is 2 grid units wide, as if you had set a class of like call2 on it, while the others are only 1 grid unit each. It's just that these grid units are totally flexible and determined by the browser instead of me having to calculate them. So in my s'mores demo, I wanted to demonstrate this proportional widths feature of Flexbox, so I tried setting one of the gallery item boxes to flex to 200 pixels, expecting it to be twice as wide as the other gallery item boxes on the line, something like this. But this is what I ended up with. The first box was only slightly larger than the others. And again, I was totally confused, but only for a little while this time because of my earlier mistake that I had thankfully learned from. What I quickly figured out was that proportional size only works as you expect if flex basis is 0, as it is when you're using single-digit flex values. This is because if all the boxes start out at 0 pixels, then all the pixels on the line are extra, so the flex 2 item gets twice as many of these pixels added on to 0 and is thus twice as wide as the others. If flex basis isn't 0, the flex 2 item won't necessarily be twice as wide as the flex 1 items. The browser is still going to give it 2 pixels for every 1 pixel that it gives to the others, but it will be adding these pixels onto starting widths. For instance, if my flex basis was 10 pixels for each of these boxes across a 50 pixel long line, the flex 2 box will end up 20 pixels wide, while each of the flex 1 boxes will be 15 pixels wide. And 20 pixels is not twice as wide as 15 pixels because math. So my flex basis was 200 pixels. So every gallery item started out at 200 pixels wide. The browser put as many as it could on a line, then wrapped. Then the browser would go back, see how much space was left on each line, and dole out those extra pixels to the boxes in a ratio of 2 to 1. So ignoring margins for the sake of example, let's say that this line, this width available is 700 pixels wide. So three 200 pixel wide boxes can fit across it. That totals up to 600 pixels. You got 100 pixels of extra. So the first one will get 50 pixels, twice as much as the others. The second will get 25. The third will get 25. That means my Flex 2 box ends up being 250 pixels wide, and the other two are 225 pixels wide, only slightly smaller. So that is how Flex Basis tripped me up again. But this second mistake only cemented what I learned about Flex Basis and the Flexbox layout algorithm for my first mistake. And together, these mistakes were actually essential to my successful completion of a full-page Flexbox layout. Regardless of whether you already know Flexbox inside and out, I want you to take away from these mistakes of mine this higher level lesson. Don't use CSS shorthand without understanding all the pieces of it. Even pieces that you don't see are there in the background doing something. So make sure that you learn what that something is so that you can harness it instead of letting it screw you up. More recently, I got the opportunity to make another mistake along the same lines of blindly using CSS that I did not understand. A couple of months ago, I needed to change the style of a lightbox modal sort of thing on booking.com. So I poked around on Google and other sites for inspiration, and I came across this slideshow with a nice skewed shadow beneath the box and wanted to imitate this. And so, of course, first I looked at their CSS, and I found that the shadow was built out of 3 separate images in 3 separate divs side by side, which was lame. I wasn't going to do that. So my idea instead was to create the shadow with generated content and then skew it with the CSS perspective function. I already knew how to do the generated content part from Nicholas Gallagher's tutorial on generated content shadows a few years ago. But although I knew there was such a thing as perspective in CSS, I had never had occasion to use it yet. So I turned to Google to look up the basic syntax. The third result was from CSS Tricks. Perfect. Love that site. So I went straight for that article. I quickly read through the article, and I looked at the associated CodePen demo shown here. And I honed in to where it said the word perspective. Perfect. That's what I need. So I copied this perspective line out of the demo. And I applied it to my shadow, as shown here. And it did nothing. So I couldn't get it to work at all. The shadow just stayed unskewed. It was perfectly straight and rectangular. And I tried some other things, but finally I gave up, and I just styled it a different way. Because no one was telling me that I needed to make a perspective skewed shadow, and there were other visual effects that I could apply more easily and quickly to meet the UX goals of the project. That's basically how we work at booking.com. We try stuff quickly, we test everything with our users, and if it doesn't work, we try something else. So everyone there makes mistakes all the time, and there's no shame in it. We just take time to learn from them and apply what we learn to the next thing we try or the next thing that we work on. But this one was kind of bugging me, so I went back later to try to figure out why it had not worked. And I started with the same article and demo, and this time noticed rotate X sitting right there by perspective. I had actually seen it before, but I had ignored it the first time around because I didn't want to turn anything, right? I just wanted to make it look all perspective-y, like the Star Wars scroll, right? So I had originally thought that I didn't need that part, though thought is perhaps too strong a word because I didn't really think it through. I just kind of looked for the word perspective in the code and grabbed it and got out of there. I hadn't realized before that I needed to combine perspective with another transform to see the perspective. Now that I was paying more attention, like actually thinking, I finally made the connection between the 2 pieces of code. Now, I hadn't worked with 3D transforms before, so although I had heard of rotate X, Y, and Z, I didn't really understand how they worked. And the whole point of going back to this was to learn from my mistakes. So I wanted to know why rotate X did what it did, not just copy and paste some code that magically made the shadow look how I wanted. So I already knew about the 3 axes. X is horizontal, left and right. Y is vertical, up and down. Z is away and towards you. You can use your hand as a helpful diagram as shown in this photo. Or if your hand is strangely deformed, maybe this diagram will suit you better. So like basically here, like the x-axis is your thumb, the y-axis is your pointer finger, and the z-axis is someone's severed finger just laying on top of your hand. So I also thought it was kind of ironic that a diagram that is supposed to be helping you to understand perspective was drawn with such awful perspective in it. But anyway, so I knew which way each axis was oriented. I just needed to know what rotate x meant. Does that mean like rotate sideways? No. Each rotate function means your box rotates around that axis, not in the direction of that axis. So in this Smashing Magazine article, I thought Peter Gaston explained it very well. Your HTML element is like a flat card, and each axis is like a string running through that card in 3 directions. And each rotate function makes the card pivot around that specified string. So if the x-axis runs horizontally, a card rotating around it would appear to tilt backward and forward, and a card tilted backwards is wider on the bottom and narrower on the top, as I wanted my shadow to be. So I'm a visual person, so to make sure I really understood this, I quickly doodled this diagram of how each rotate function pivots around its axis, and that cemented it for me. It was clear now that what I needed was rotate x and y. So I applied my new knowledge to my shadow, adding rotate x to the existing perspective bit, and it worked perfectly now. Again, making the mistake was beneficial. It helped me learn it better. If I had in the beginning correctly copied both the rotate and perspective lines from the CodePen demo, instead of making the mistake of leaving out rotate, it would have worked fine. So I would have had no reason to learn why it was really working. That means that I wouldn't be able to reuse and build on the code in other situations. So the mistake pushed me to gain a true understanding of something new, and since I understand it now, I can use it on other things and in other ways. Beyond just learning about 3D transforms, I learned that sometimes pen and paper can make a new concept real to you. We tend to think of sketching as a tool for creating UX and design mockups or for teaching others, but it's also great to help yourself learn technical or abstract stuff. That little drawing was in no way meant to be a complete diagram of how 3D rotate works or understandable to anyone else, really. It was just a quick doodle that I created for my own benefit to get my rough understanding out of my head and onto paper so I could look at it and validate that what was in my head was correct. Sometimes even 2D can be tricky. Recently, I was working on a layout for Booking.com where I wanted a box pinned to the bottom of another box. So I immediately tried absolute positioning. That's basically been the kind of go-to, non-hacky cross-browser way that we've had to pin something to the bottom of something else and make it grow up with its content instead of down. But part of testing our work at Booking.com before we release it is trying it in a variety of our 42 languages to make sure that long ones don't break the layout, for instance. And when I was testing it this way, I found that it was quite possible that with a combination of a long language and a long destination name, that my box could overflow. So those were 2 unknown variables that I could not control for, but I had to plan ahead for. So I needed something less rigid than absolute positioning. It took me a while to think of what that something could be, though. Part of the problem is that I was thinking about the page with a very traditional sort of flow. The content starts at the top left and it moves across and down, across and down. The layout methods that we've been using for years have all relied on this flow. When we used tables for layout, they were made up of rows, TR elements, stacked from top to bottom. We had to stick everything in rows, horizontal. We didn't have to constrain ourselves to rows with floats, but they still kind of assumed this horizontal view of the page. Floats could go left or right, horizontal. And layouts were still built in a row-oriented way. You used a wrapper div for each new row of floats. And that's gotten even more ingrained into today's layout grid frameworks. Almost all of them depend on putting your columns into some sort of row div, or the layout will just fall apart and not work. So our layout tools are really row dependent. It's easy to move things sideways, place things horizontally. It's hard to move things up or down. But this is not the case anymore with Flexbox. Flexbox is direction agnostic. The content does not have to flow left to right, top to bottom. It can flow from the bottom up, which is exactly what I wanted to happen with my box. Start out at the bottom and then expand upwards with more content. So I could do this with flex direction column reverse. It's just like flex direction column. It stacks the flex items on top of each other, but instead of starting from the top and moving down, it starts at the bottom and moves up. So the first item in the HTML is the lowest in its container, not the highest. This seemed to solve my problem, except in IE 11. It does support Flexbox, and it supports flex direction column reverse, but it seems to have a bug with min height, not just related to Flexbox, but with other layout methods too. So it kind of acts like the box with min height has 0 height when there are other boxes that need to base their positions off of the min height. So in this case, my box did not move to the bottom in IE 11. The nice thing about CSS is that there are often a ton of different ways to accomplish the same thing. And I tried lots of ways to avoid this display issue in IE 11, both with and without Flexbox, but I kept running into problems with min height each time. I finally discovered that I could add an extra wrapper div, make that into a flex container too, and that would force IE to recognize that the original container was full height, not 0. The extra wrapper was not ideal, but not horrible either, and it actually would come in handy for some other styling hooks that I wanted, so I decided that this was an acceptable solution. IE bugs aside, running into this problem of an overflowing bottom pinned item really forced me to think about web layout in new ways. It helped me start breaking out of this kind of row mindset that our web layout techniques have imposed on us for so long, to be more open to the new layout methods that we have now with Flexbox and other modern tools. So often, the new techniques that we try in web design and development require us to not just memorize syntax, but more importantly, it's about learning to shift the way that you think about the problem and visualize the solution. I kind of felt that way when I made the switch from table layout to float layout. There was a certain point where I just started thinking in floats, where table layout actually became harder for me because I no longer thought about web layout from that perspective and its limitations. So this was a similar situation. It helped me learn not just how Flexbox works technically, but also how to start thinking from a Flexbox point of view, more direction agnostic, instead of being limited to the sort of things that were possible before in my ideas. But perhaps using Flexbox seems to you to be a mistake in and of itself. After all, it is not universally supported, and there's no Flexbox polyfill. When I talk about Flexbox, I often get asked what I use for a fallback. I don't have one single answer. What I do as a fallback depends on the situation. My simplest fallback approach is to do nothing. It may sound crazy, but if I'm just using Flexbox for cosmetic enhancements, not essential layout, I think it's perfectly fine for different browsers to see different things. That's already happening anyway. I don't provide any fallbacks for border radius, or box shadow, or text shadow, or multi-columns. You probably don't either. So if I'm using Flexbox just to nicely center a couple things with each other, it's not a big deal if they are top-aligned instead in IE 7, 8, and 9. So if you're using Flexbox just to fine-tune alignment and that sort of thing, it's completely acceptable and sensible to provide no fallback to attempt to imitate that visual effect in old browsers. It's progressive enhancement, pure and simple. If you are using Flexbox to actually control layout, like placing items beside each other or sizing them, you may decide that this is a more essential part of the design and you want to provide a fallback. In this case, you can basically use any layout CSS that you normally would as your Flexbox fallback because most of the time, both layout methods can coexist. Display table cell is a great alternative to Flexbox because it affects the boxes in a lot of the same ways that Flexbox does. So you can have equal height columns, you can have stretching and shrinking to fit content. But display table cell does not allow content to wrap when needed. If you need wrapping or you need to support IE 7, inline block is one thing you could try, or float is another good fallback for Flexbox layout. And you can use both floating and Flexbox on the same element. There are a few problems that you may run into though. First, if you're using the 2009 Flexbox syntax for old Safari and Android, those browsers have a bug where a flex item that's also floated will disappear. Luckily, the fix is simple. You just add position relative to the floated flex item to make it reappear. Second, when you float, you often give the content following the float a large side margin to get it out of the way of the float. But flex items don't need this margin there to sit side by side, so adding it would only introduce a huge gap between the flex items. So this is when you need to break out Modernizer and have it add the Flexbox supporting or non-supporting classes to the HTML tag, and then you can add the margin only when Flexbox isn't supported and when floating is being used instead. Most of the time you do not need Modernizer to separate out Flexbox and non-Flexbox fallback styles, at least in my experience with using Flexbox. Most of the time it seems like Flexbox is really good at just overriding in browsers that understand it. Sometimes, though, you do need to isolate certain properties, and so Modernizer makes that easy. Excuse me. So, in the case of that bottom-aligned box within a box, I chose not to provide any fallback for non-supporting non-Flexbox browsers. They just see the box top-aligned instead of bottom-aligned. Another place that I used Flexbox on Booking.com recently is what we call the mini info windows on the maps that show when you hover over a marker. I used Flexbox to lay out the review score and the price on opposite ends of the same line. Flexbox was the best choice here because of the extreme flexibility that the mini info window needed to accommodate the unknown content and multiple languages that we use and deal with on Booking.com. So I couldn't give either of these two blocks a width, not even in percentages or ems, because the length of the content can vary wildly. For instance, the review score may be just a number with no word beside it, or the review word may be super long in some languages, or the review block may be absent altogether if it's a new property that doesn't have many reviews yet. And the price can be who knows how many digits long, or it can be the word sold out, which again varies in length by language. So without set widths, inline block would not work. It wouldn't move the price block to the right side. So inline block was out. Table cell would work without set widths, but if the content was long, the two pieces could overlap instead of the second block wrapping to a new line, which would be totally unacceptable, having text laying on top of text. So that left floating and Flexbox as my layout options. I used both. Float for older browsers, then overrode it with Flexbox. And I didn't have to use Modernizer and hide pieces of CSS from certain browsers. Flexbox just kind of takes over if the browser understands it. So no matter what, the blocks will appear side by side in all browsers and will wrap when needed. The wrapping and alignment of the text just won't be quite as nice looking in non-Flexbox browsers. So I have a fallback for the layout, but not the cosmetic details, which always vary by browser and platform anyway. So I don't think using Flexbox is itself a mistake if you use it in a limited way as progressive enhancement like this example. It can be very simple to provide fallbacks when needed. These mistakes that I've shared with you so far have been solitary affairs. I was the only one affected by my mistakes since none were in live work, and in each case I figured out my problem on my own. But we all make mistakes in live websites too, and sometimes need help from others to figure them out and get them fixed. One situation that I experienced like this had to do with both CSS and accessibility. At my previous employer, I kept running into situations where we needed to add hidden text for the benefit of screen reader users. The most common example of this is probably a skip nav link, which is often hidden until focused on, such as on the BBC site, but it needs to be read even when it's hidden. But there's lots of other times when hidden text can come in handy for screen reader users. For instance, if you are using background image icons or icon fonts to stand in for real text, since you don't have an HTML image element, you can't use the alt attribute, but you still need to provide a text equivalent for meaningful functional images. Or what about when multiple form fields use the same piece of on-screen text to act as a label for them visually? Screen readers need each form field to have its own independent label, which isn't always possible in complex forms, so hidden labels are a good option there. That's what Doodle uses for their complex form within a table. On the flip side, there are times when it's good to hide content, not just visually, but also make sure that it is not spoken by screen readers. A quite common use case for this is a drop-down or tree menu with dozens of options. The screen reader user should only hear the currently open or active section of the menu, not all the hidden stuff. So when it's visible, it should be spoken, and when it's hidden, it should be ignored by screen readers too. Another time that you would want to make sure a screen reader doesn't read hidden content is if you're using like a honeypot field in a form to catch spam bots. So again, I kept running across situations like this where we needed hidden text for screen reader users. So I decided to make 3 standardized CSS classes that we could add to content to do one of 3 things: hide it visually and orally, hide just the text of the element, not the whole element, but keep its text spoken, or hide the whole element visually, but keep its text announced by screen readers. The first one was easy. Display none or visibility hidden will hide text in a way that also makes screen readers ignore it and not speak it. The second one was not too bad either. Giving text indent a huge negative value places the text off screen, but keeps it read by screen readers. So the box for the element isn't moved anywhere, just its text. And this is useful for things like links or buttons, where you may have a background color or a sprite as a background image. So you still want to see the button. You just want to have some hidden text inside those button tags too, so that there is some content there to be spoken and explain the meaning of the sprite image. The third class, to hide the element but keep its text spoken, took more work because there are so many ways to hide elements. But I wanted to find the most bulletproof method that worked in today's browsers and screen readers without a bunch of unnecessary cruft that had been added years ago to help, like IE5 on the Mac or something ridiculously old. So I read this article on the Yahoo Accessibility blog on a new hiding method that was touted as solving a lot of the problems with some of the older methods. And this is the CSS that the article recommended. It basically uses clip to make the box disappear, along with killing any padding, border, or overflow that it might have. So I copied this CSS, I used it on a variety of elements, I tested it on a variety of screen readers and browsers, and I found that it did indeed hide the text well, but keep it spoken, which is great. So I got the class added to some of our style sheets, along with the two other classes that I showed you, and developers started using it, both of which were no small feat at the place where I worked. Change did not happen quickly there. So I was pretty proud of myself. But at some point after this, while testing a page, I discovered that in Firefox, NVDA, which is a popular free screen reader for Windows, would not read a form label if it had this last class applied. I don't know if I just overlooked this in my testing or if it was a new bug, but anyway, it was a bug that was happening that I needed to fix. So I started the classic debugging technique of delete half the code and see if the bug goes away. And that narrowed it down to overflow hidden. Removing this part caused the labels to be read correctly in Firefox by NVDA. The strange thing was the content was still hidden without overflow hidden. So it seemed like it was therefore safe to remove, but I figured it must have been put there for a reason. So I wanted to read the Yahoo article again to try to figure out the purpose of that bit and make sure that I wouldn't be screwing up something else by removing it. But I got a 404 on the article. It had been taken down. Luckily, I remembered who wrote it. So I got on Twitter and I asked the author where it went. And he and I, through the power of tweeting, got Yahoo to republish it, which is pretty awesome. So the article was back up. I reread it, that helped some, but I was still not totally clear why overflow hidden was there. So I tweeted some more to the author, which got me closer, but I was still not completely certain. So I made a demo so I could actually see it, and I got it. Some browsers don't seem to follow the spec for clip correctly, and they allow descendant content of the element that is clipped to still act like it takes up space on the page. So even though you don't see any content because it's been clipped completely away, the browser still acts like the padding from the descendant is there, and it generates this unnecessary vertical scroll bar to it. So here, there is no visible content underneath the heading, so the page should only be as tall as that heading, and thus doesn't need a vertical scroll bar. But because a child of the hidden element has a bunch of padding, the browser creates one anyway. So overflow hidden on the parent basically hides this child padding from the browser so that it won't generate scroll bars where they're not needed. So this is an edge case. It's pretty unlikely that you are going to have padding on a child of an element that's hidden. And even if you do, there will likely be lots of other visible elements further down the page that are going to necessitate a vertical scroll bar anyway. You're not going to have a page like this with just a heading, a hidden element, and nothing else. So now that I understood what overflow hidden did, I could decide whether it was safe to remove it, and it was. With the ways that we were using the hiding class, it was very unlikely that we would come across the scroll bar issue. So it didn't make sense to have overflow hidden there by default. So to fix the screen reader problem on my employer site, I removed overflow hidden from new instances of the class, added to style sheets going forward, and I then updated the documentation to advise adding it on an as-needed basis. So we didn't need it there by default, but I wanted to make sure that everyone knew that it was the fix for a mystery scroll bar situation should that come up. On the bright side, this bug seems to have been finally fixed in Firefox or NVDA, whichever one was responsible for it, when I tested it again while making this presentation. Regardless, hopefully you learned about how to hide text accessibly and a few cases where it makes sense to do so. I learned that I should not copy code I find online without knowing what it does. Understand what the code does so that you can adapt it to your needs, because a one-size-fits-all solution is not always best. There's often lots of extra stuff thrown in to cover all the bases, but your use cases might not require every little bit. Also, don't be afraid to reach out and get help from others, even those you don't know, like the author of an article or a script or something that you're struggling with. I'm sometimes afraid to ask questions publicly online, worried that I will look dumb or way behind the times or something. But people in our industry are usually really helpful and friendly and willing to help total strangers online. So don't let fear of failure stop you from learning or trying something new or hard. Be willing to fail, and not only that, share your failures with the rest of us. I know that's asking a lot. We make ourselves really vulnerable when we open up to admit our mistakes and failures, but we need that vulnerability to be innovative and grow. Dr. Brene-Brown is a research professor in social work, and she's found that those people who are willing to make themselves vulnerable, who still find it uncomfortable but accept it as necessary and embrace it, are the people with the most courage, not fear or weakness. And this courage is essential to creativity. So I know we make ourselves really vulnerable when we try new things that may lead to failure, and when we open up to admit our mistakes. But not only does this vulnerability help us to be more creative, it helps those that we share it with too. On the practical side, sharing mistakes is essential for helping yourself and others to learn why an error happened, of course, and what you can do to prevent it from happening again. I've had to work at getting better at this in the past year as I've worked at booking.com. We A/B test everything on the site, which is really cool when you have actual proof that your design helped people accomplish their tasks, and rather painful when you have actual proof that people did not use or like that beautiful new feature that you thought was awesome. But we don't see unsuccessful experiments as failures to be punished. By learning what doesn't work for our users, we get invaluable insight into their behavior and ideas for what to try next that could work. It sounds kind of weird, but we often would rather an experiment be negative than neutral, because that way at least we can learn something from it. So in the end, negative experiments actually do benefit the business by helping expose and correct problems. It's important not only that we learn and grow from our own failures, but that others learn and grow from them as well, and that only happens when we share them, of course. We're always going to be stuck comparing our flawed private first drafts to other people's public finished masterpieces if those people don't reveal how many crappy drafts they went through before that masterpiece was finished. Our industry is full of creative people who are so smart and do such amazing work, but all of us make mistakes, take shortcuts from time to time, and put imperfect work out there. The comments in people's code can be pretty telling. I already showed you this comment from my CSS when I was struggling with Flexbox. I found these comments posted online. Both of these comments are two-parters. The second half was written at a later date than the first, when some poor, confused person went back in to edit the code. Now, despite the mistakes that we make, please remember that it's still awesome that you can write a shred of CSS to begin with. I made up this stat, but I feel pretty confident about it, so I'm going to share it anyway. 99% of the population of the world does not know how to write CSS. So if you do, even mistake-ridden CSS, you are exceptional, not a failure. Not everyone is insecure about their status as a quality web designer or developer, of course. Some of you are at peace with your weaknesses, willing to admit them, and confident in your ability to keep growing or just keep continuing to be awesome. I hope that your confidence translates into courage, the courage to make yourself vulnerable by sharing your weaknesses with others so that we can all learn from them, yourself included. I have shared a few of my CSS mistakes with you. I hope that this means that you won't repeat them, but instead will go out, try something new, and make fantastic mistakes of your very own. Thank you.
Bye.